The cold October wind cut through Rosa's thin jacket like a knife. She pulled it tighter around her small frame, but it didn't help much. The jacket had been old even when her grandmother was alive, and now it had more holes than fabric. Rosa stood outside the big glass windows of Antonio's Italian restaurant, watching the warm glow of lights inside and the people laughing around their tables. She had been walking the streets for almost 4 hours now, trying to find something to eat. The sandwich she'd gotten from a kind lady that morning was long gone, and her stomach hurt from emptiness. She was only 12 years old, but she'd learned quickly in the 3 weeks since her grandmother died. The world wasn't kind to kids with nowhere to go. Rosa pressed her face against the cold glass, her breath making little fog circles on the window. Inside, everything looked so warm and perfect. Waiters in crisp white shirts moved between tables carrying huge plates of steaming pasta. She could almost smell the garlic and tomatoes through the window. Families sat together talking and smiling. A couple in the corner shared a pizza, and Rosa's mouth watered just looking at it. But it wasn't the food that made her heart skip a beat. In the far corner of the restaurant, half hidden behind a decorative plant, sat a beautiful grand piano. Its black surface gleamed under the soft lights, and even from outside Rosa could see how elegant it looked. The piano sat there untouched, like everyone had forgotten it existed. Rosa's grandmother had taught her to play piano. Every evening after dinner they would sit together at the old upright piano in their tiny apartment, and her grandmother would guide her fingers across the keys. "Music is magic, little one," she would say with that gentle smile. "It can say things when words aren't enough." Those piano lessons had been the best part of Rosa's day, back when she had a home and someone who loved her. But then her grandmother got sick. Very sick. Within 2 months she was gone, and Rosa found herself alone in the world. There were no other family members to take her in. The landlord came 3 days after the funeral and told Rosa she had to leave. A 12-year-old couldn't pay rent, he said. She had nowhere to go. Now, standing outside this fancy restaurant, Rosa had an idea. It was crazy, probably stupid, but she was desperate. What if they let her play that piano? What if she could play just one song? And maybe someone inside would feel sorry for her and buy her some food. Her fingers tingled at the thought of touching piano keys again. She took a deep breath and pushed the heavy wooden door open. A wave of warm air hit her face, along with the incredible smell of garlic bread and marinara sauce. The noise of conversation and clinking dishes filled her ears. For a moment she just stood there, feeling out of place in her dirty clothes and messy hair. A woman in a fancy black dress stood at a small podium near the entrance. She had her hair pulled back tight and wore bright red lipstick. She looked down at Rosa, and her expression changed immediately. Her nose wrinkled a little, like she smelled something bad. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, but her tone said she really didn't want to help at all. Rosa's voice came out smaller than she wanted. "Please, ma'am. I can play piano. I'm really good, I promise. Could I just play one song? Maybe someone would." She trailed off, too embarrassed to finish. The woman's face hardened. "Absolutely not. This is a restaurant, not a charity. You need to leave right now before you disturb our guests." Rosa felt her face burning. A few people at nearby tables had started looking at her. She wanted to run out the door and never come back, but her empty stomach kept her feet planted where they stood. "But I really can play," Rosa tried again, her voice shaking. "My grandmother taught me. I said no." The woman reached out as if to guide Rosa back toward the door. "We don't allow beggars in here." That word stung. Beggar. Is that what she was now? Rosa felt tears starting to form in her eyes, but she blinked them back hard. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of all these people. Just then, a man's voice cut through the awkward moment. "Wait, what's going on here?" An older man emerged from somewhere in the back of the restaurant. He had gray hair, a thick mustache, and flour on his white apron. He looked about the same age her grandmother had been. His eyes were dark and serious, but not unkind. The woman in the black dress turned to him quickly. "Nothing, Mr. Antonio, just a street kid trying to get in." "I'm handling it." But Antonio wasn't looking at the woman. He was looking at Rosa, studying her face with an expression she couldn't quite read. His eyes moved from her worn-out shoes to her thin jacket to her face, which she knew was probably smudged with dirt. "You said you can play piano?" he asked directly. Rosa nodded fast, hope blooming in her chest again. "Yes, sir. Really well. My grandmother taught me before she stopped, not wanting to cry. Antonio looked at the beautiful piano in the corner, then back at Rosa. The woman in the black dress made a small sound of protest, but he held up his hand to silence her. "Please, Mr. Antonio," the woman said anyway. "Think about the atmosphere. The guests will survive." Antonio interrupted, still watching Rosa. Something in his face had softened. Maybe he saw something in her eyes, or maybe her desperation reminded him of something from his own past. Whatever it was, he made a decision. "One song," he said firmly. "You play one song. If you're good, really good, I'll give you a hot meal. If not, you leave and don't come back. Deal?" Rosa couldn't believe what she was hearing. She nodded so hard her neck hurt. Yes, thank you, sir. Thank you so much." She didn't wait for him to change his mind. Rosa hurried toward the piano, weaving between tables. A few diners glanced at her with curious expressions, but most people were too busy with their own meals and conversations to pay attention to the small, dirty girl heading toward the forgotten piano in the corner. When Rosa reached the piano, she stood in front of it for a moment just looking. It was even more beautiful up close. She reached out and touched the smooth black surface, leaving a small fingerprint in the dust. Nobody had played this piano in a long time. She sat down on the bench, adjusting her position the way her grandmother had taught her. The seat was covered in soft burgundy velvet, worn smooth from age. Rosa placed her hands on the keys, and even though they were cold and dusty, they felt like coming home. Behind her, the restaurant continued its noise and bustle. People laughed and talked. Dishes clinked. Most of them had no idea what was about to happen. They didn't know that in the next 5 minutes everything in that restaurant would change. Rosa closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She thought about her grandmother, about those evenings at their old piano, about everything she'd lost and everything she was fighting for now. Her fingers rested on the keys. Ready. It was time to play. Rosa's fingers trembled slightly as they rested on the piano keys. She could feel dozens of eyes on her back now. Some people had noticed the small, ragged girl sitting at the fancy piano, and they were watching with curiosity mixed with judgment. She heard someone whisper something, probably wondering what Antonio was thinking letting a street kid touch his expensive instrument. But Rosa blocked it all out. She had to. This was her one chance, maybe her only chance to eat something real today. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, soft and encouraging like always. "Don't think about the people watching, little one. Think about the music. Let it flow through you like water through a stream." Rosa pressed down on the first key and a single note rang out through the restaurant. It was soft, almost hesitant. Then another note. And another. She began to play a piece her grandmother had taught her years ago. A classical composition that most people wouldn't recognize. It wasn't famous like Mozart or Beethoven. It was something quieter, more personal. A piece about loss and memory and holding on to hope when everything else is gone. At first, the restaurant noise continued around her. Forks scraped against plates. Conversations carried on. A waiter called out an order to the kitchen. The businessman at table 7 kept reading his newspaper. The family near the window kept laughing at something the father had said. Most people didn't even glance in her direction, but Rosa didn't stop. Her fingers began to move more confidently across the keys. The music started soft like a whisper, telling a story only those who really listened could hear. It spoke of morning sunlight through old curtains, of gentle hands braiding a little girl's hair, of soup simmering on a stove and the sound of laughter filling a small apartment. The notes began to grow stronger. Rosa's hands moved faster now, remembering every lesson her grandmother had taught her. Her posture straightened. She leaned into the music, putting her whole body into each phrase. The melody climbed higher, painting pictures in the air of better days and warm memories. That's when things began to change. A woman at table 3 stopped mid-sentence, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. She turned her head toward the piano, listening, really listening. At table 9, an elderly couple who had been eating in comfortable silence both looked up at the same moment, their eyes finding the small figure at the piano. The waiter, who had been about to push through the kitchen door, paused, his hand on the wood. He stood there holding a tray of dirty dishes, suddenly unable to move. In the kitchen, the head cook looked up from the pot he was stirring, hearing something beautiful drifting through the noise of his busy restaurant. One by one, conversations began to fade. People stopped eating. The businessman slowly lowered his newspaper, his eyes moving toward the corner where the piano sat. The family by the window fell silent, even the children who moments before had been giggling and playing with their napkins. Rosa didn't notice any of this. Her eyes were closed now, completely lost in the music. Tears had started sliding down her cheeks, leaving clean tracks through the dirt on her face. She was thinking about her grandmother, about the day she taught her this exact piece, sitting beside her on a wobbly piano bench in their tiny apartment. "This song is special," her grandmother had said. "It's about loving someone so much that even when they're gone, you can still feel them with you. Every note holds a memory, Rosa. Every chord is like a hug you can't see but you can feel." Now, playing in this restaurant full of strangers, Rosa understood what her grandmother meant. Each note she played was a memory. Her grandmother's smile, the way she smelled like lavender soap, how she would hum while cooking dinner, the sound of her voice reading bedtime stories. All of it poured out through Rosa's fingers and into the air of Antonio's restaurant. The music swelled, building to something bigger. Rosa's hands flew across the keys with surprising grace for someone so young, so small, so broken by life. The melody dipped and soared, speaking of joy and sorrow all mixed together. It talked about loss without saying a single word. It screamed about loneliness while sounding beautiful. It was the sound of a child's heart breaking and somehow still beating. By now, every single person in the restaurant had stopped what they were doing. Complete strangers sat frozen in their seats, captivated by what they were hearing. Some people leaned forward, trying to see the girl at the piano better. Others closed their own eyes, letting the music wash over them like a wave. At table 12, a young mother felt tears starting in her eyes. She didn't know why exactly. She had a good life, a loving family, nothing to cry about. But something in that music reached into her chest and squeezed. It reminded her of her own mother who had passed away last year. She hadn't cried at the funeral, hadn't let herself feel it fully. But now, listening to this music, the grief came flooding back. The businessman who had been so absorbed in his newspaper felt his throat tighten. He thought about his daughter, who he hadn't called in 3 months because he was always too busy with work. This music made him feel how much time he was wasting, how many moments he was missing while chasing things that didn't really matter. An older man sitting alone at the bar, eating his usual Thursday dinner by himself, felt something crack inside his chest. His wife had died 5 years ago, and he came to this restaurant every week because it was where they used to celebrate their anniversary. The music made him remember her laugh, her touch, everything he'd lost and could never get back. Antonio stood by the kitchen door, his arms crossed over his chest, watching Rosa play. His eyes were wet. He hadn't cried in years. Not since he was a boy in Sicily when his own mother had died and left him and his 3 brothers to fend for themselves. He knew what it was like to be hungry, to be alone, to feel like the world had forgotten you existed. This girl's music brought all of it back, but somehow it didn't hurt the way he expected. It felt like healing, like someone finally understanding. The hostess who had tried to throw Rosa out now stood with her hand pressed against her mouth, ashamed of herself. How could she have been so cruel? How could she have looked at this child and seen only dirt and inconvenience, when inside her lived this incredible gift? Rosa's playing grew more intense. Her small body swayed with the music. Her fingers danced across the keys like they had a life of their own. The notes cascaded through the restaurant, weaving between tables, wrapping around hearts, squeezing tears from eyes that hadn't cried in years. The melody told a story everyone could understand, even if they didn't know they were understanding it. It spoke about loving someone, about losing them, about carrying on even when you don't know how, about being so tired and scared and alone, but still finding the strength to keep breathing, keep walking, keep hoping that maybe tomorrow would be different. A teenage girl eating dinner with her parents felt tears rolling down her face. She'd been fighting with her mom all week about stupid things, and now she felt ridiculous for being angry over clothes and curfews when this girl playing piano had lost everything. Waiters stood along the walls, their trays forgotten in their hands. Cooks crowded the kitchen doorway, staring out at the dining room. Even the dishwasher, who barely spoke English and usually kept to himself, had come out to listen. The music was building now, reaching towards something. Rosa's fingers moved faster, the notes pouring out like a river that had been dammed up too long. This was everything she'd been holding inside for 3 weeks. All the fear, the sadness, the desperate hope that somehow things would get better. It was the sound of a little girl trying to be brave when she wanted to collapse and cry. It was the sound of survival, and then the melody began to soften. Rosa's playing grew gentler, quieter like a lullaby. The notes floated through the air like leaves falling from a tree. Soft, peaceful, beautiful. It was the sound of acceptance, of letting go while still holding on to love. Rosa played the final chord, letting it ring out through the silent restaurant. Her hands lifted from the keys and settled in her lap. She sat very still, her eyes still closed, her face still wet with tears. For a long moment, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The restaurant was completely silent in a way it had never been before. 50 people sat frozen, strangers connected by the music they'd just heard. Then someone started clapping. The first clap came from the elderly man sitting alone at the bar. His weathered hands came together once, twice, then faster. The sound broke the spell that had frozen everyone in place. Suddenly, the entire restaurant erupted. People jumped to their feet, clapping so hard their hands hurt. The sound was thunderous, filling every corner of the room. 50 people applauding at once, and it wasn't the polite golf clap you hear at boring events. This was real. This was people clapping because something had touched them deep in their souls. Rosa's eyes flew open in shock. She turned around on the piano bench, and what she saw made her heart nearly stop. Everyone was standing. Everyone was clapping for her. The businessman had tears streaming down his face and didn't even seem to care. The young mother was wiping her eyes with her napkin. The teenage girl was clapping so hard it looked like her hands might break. "Bravo!" someone shouted from the back. "Beautiful. Amazing," called out another voice. Rosa just sat there frozen on the piano bench, completely overwhelmed. She had hoped maybe someone would feel sorry for her and buy her dinner. She never expected this. Never imagined anything like this could happen. Antonio stood by the kitchen door, still clapping, his face wet with tears he wasn't bothering to hide. He was an old man who had seen a lot in his life, but this was something else entirely. This small, dirty, hungry child had just given his restaurant something magical, something none of them would ever forget. The businessman was the first to move toward Rosa. He was a tall man in an expensive gray suit, the kind of person who probably made important decisions every day without blinking. But right now his hands were shaking as he pulled out his wallet. He walked straight to the piano, and Rosa shrank back a little, not sure what was happening. "Young lady," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That was the most beautiful thing I've heard in 30 years. He pulled out several bills and pressed them into Rosa's small hand. She looked down and her eyes went wide. There were 5 $20 bills, $100. She'd never held that much money in her entire life. "Sir, I can't," Rosa started, but he cut her off. "Yes, you can. You earned it. Buy yourself some good meals, please." He squeezed her hand gently, then walked back to his table, but not before pulling out his phone to call someone. Rosa would later learn he called his daughter for the first time in months. Then others started coming forward. It was like a dam had broken. A woman in her 40s rushed over, unwinding the scarf from around her neck. It was beautiful, soft and warm, much nicer than anything Rosa had ever owned. "Here, sweetie," the woman said, wrapping the scarf around Rosa's thin shoulders. "You're shivering. Please take it." Her voice cracked. "My mother used to play piano. She passed away last year. When I heard you play, I felt like she was here again. Thank you for that gift." Rosa didn't know what to say. Thank you seemed too small for what these people were giving her, but it was all she had. "Thank you so much," she whispered. The family who had been sitting by the window came over next. The father knelt down so he was eye level with Rosa. "My daughter is about your age," he said, glancing back at his own little girl who was watching with wide eyes. "Would you like to join us for dinner? We just ordered, and we'd be honored to have you eat with us." Rosa felt her lip trembling. She nodded because she didn't trust her voice. Real food, a real meal, with nice people who were smiling at her like she mattered. More people kept coming. An older woman pressed a warm coat into Rosa's arms. "My grandson grew out of this last year. It's just been sitting in my closet. Please, it's yours now." A young couple gave her $40. A construction worker with rough hands and a kind face gave her $20. People were pulling bills from their wallets, coins from their pockets, anything they could give this child who had given them something they couldn't name but felt in their bones. The hostess who had tried to throw Rosa out approached slowly, her face full of shame. She stopped a few feet away, not sure if she had the right to come closer after how cruel she'd been. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I was so wrong. So wrong. Please forgive me." She reached into her purse and pulled out her own wallet, giving Rosa everything she had, about $60. "I'm ashamed of how I treated you. You're incredibly talented." Rosa looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "It's okay," she said softly, because what else could she say? She was too tired to be angry, and these people were being so kind now that it was hard to hold on to anything else. Antonio finally pushed through the small crowd that had formed around Rosa. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, and she looked up at him with eyes that held so much hope it nearly broke his heart all over again. "Come with me," he said quietly. "Let's get you some food, yes?" He led Rosa to a booth in the corner, the best seat in the house. The family who had invited her to eat with them followed, along with a few others who just wanted to sit nearby, like they couldn't bear to be too far away from her now. Antonio snapped his fingers at one of the waiters. "Bring her everything," he said. "The good pasta, the bread, soup, salad, dessert, everything, and don't you dare charge for any of it." "Yes, sir," the waiter said, smiling at Rosa with real warmth. As they waited for the food, people kept stopping by the table. They wanted to talk to her, to know her story. Rosa found herself explaining, in her small, quiet voice, about her grandmother, about being alone, about living on the streets for 3 weeks, about how hungry and scared she was every single day. Every person who heard her story looked like they'd been punched in the stomach. A 12-year-old child, alone on the streets. How was that possible? How had they all been walking past kids, like her, without really seeing them? The young mother who had cried during the performance sat down across from Rosa. Her name was Lisa, and she had 2 kids at home with their father tonight. "Sweetie, where are you staying?" she asked gently. Rosa looked down at her hands, which were now full of money she couldn't quite believe was real. "Wherever I can find," she admitted. "Sometimes behind the library, sometimes in the park if it's not too cold." Lisa's face crumpled. "Oh, honey, no, that's not safe. That's not right." She looked at her husband, who nodded at the unspoken question in her eyes. "We have a guest room. Would you like to stay with us, at least for tonight? You shouldn't be on the streets." Rosa's throat closed up. She couldn't speak. She just nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks again. A real bed, a safe place to sleep. It felt like a dream. The food started arriving. Plate after plate of the most amazing things Rosa had ever seen. Spaghetti with meatballs so big they barely fit on the fork. Fresh bread that was still warm, with butter that melted the second it touched the surface. Soup that smelled like heaven. A salad with more vegetables than she'd eaten in weeks. Rosa stared at it all, not sure where to start. Her stomach growled so loud that everyone at the table laughed, but it was warm laughter, kind laughter. The kind that makes you feel included instead of embarrassed. "Go ahead, Bambina," Antonio said, using the same word her grandmother used to call her. "Eat. You earned every bite." Rosa picked up her fork with shaking hands and took the first bite of pasta. It was the most delicious thing she'd ever tasted. Or maybe it was just that she was so hungry anything would have tasted like magic. She ate slowly at first, trying to have manners, but soon she was eating faster, unable to stop herself. Nobody judged her. Nobody made comments about how she was eating. They just let her be a hungry child finally getting fed. Antonio sat down across from her, watching her eat with a soft expression on his weathered face. When she paused to take a drink of water, he leaned forward. "Tell me about your grandmother," he said. "The one who taught you to play." Rosa swallowed her food and wiped her mouth with the napkin. And then, sitting in that warm restaurant surrounded by kind strangers who had become something like friends, she started to talk. She told them about her grandmother's small apartment, about the old piano that was out of tune but still beautiful, about the songs they used to play together, about how sick her grandmother got, and how Rosa had held her hand at the end. People listened, really listened, and when she finished, there wasn't a dry eye at the table. Antonio nodded slowly like he was making a decision about something important. He looked at Rosa with an expression she couldn't quite read. It was serious, but warm. Sad, but hopeful. "I have an idea," he said. "But first, you eat. Then we talk. About your future, yes?" Rosa nodded, hope blooming in her chest like a flower pushing through concrete. Rosa ate until her stomach felt like it might burst. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been truly full. The pasta, the bread, the soup. All of it settled warmly inside her, making her feel almost sleepy. Safe. For the first time in 3 weeks, she felt something close to safe. Antonio sat across from her the whole time, occasionally sipping his coffee but mostly just watching her with that thoughtful expression. The restaurant had slowly returned to normal around them. People went back to their tables, though the energy in the room felt different now, softer somehow, like everyone had shared something important together. When Rosa finally put down her fork, unable to eat another bite, Antonio leaned back in his chair and folded his hands on the table. "So," he said gently, "you have money now, yes? From all these kind people. That's good. That will help. And Lisa has offered you a bed for tonight, which is very generous." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But what about tomorrow? And the day after that? What is your plan, little one?" Rosa's full stomach suddenly felt heavy. She looked down at her hands. "I don't know," she whispered. "I've just been trying to get through each day. I haven't thought much past that." Antonio nodded, like this was the answer he expected. "You need more than just tonight. You need school. You need a home. You need—" He gestured at the piano in the corner. "You need to keep playing music. Your grandmother would want that, yes?" Rosa's eyes filled with tears again. "Yes, she always said I was meant to play, that it was my gift." Her voice got even smaller. "But I don't know how. I don't have anywhere to go, no family, nothing." "Well," Antonio said, and something in his voice made Rosa look up. His eyes were warm, crinkled at the corners. "What if we change that? What if you had somewhere to go?" Rosa didn't understand. She just stared at him, afraid to hope for whatever he was about to say. Antonio called over to one of the waiters. "Carlos, bring me the phone, please." The waiter brought over a cordless phone, and Antonio dialed a number he clearly knew by heart. He waited, then his whole face softened into a smile. "Francesca?" "Yes, it's me." "Are you still awake?" "Good, good. Listen, something happened tonight. Something important." He paused, listening. "No, nothing bad. Actually, something beautiful. But I need you to come down to the restaurant right now." "Yes, I know it's late. Trust me, my love. This can't wait." He hung up and looked at Rosa. "My wife. She's coming. She needs to hear your story and meet you herself." Rosa felt nervous suddenly. What if his wife didn't like her? What if she thought Antonio was being foolish? They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Antonio ordered Rosa a slice of chocolate cake, even though she insisted she was full. "There's always room for cake," he said with a wink that reminded her so much of her grandmother she almost started crying again. The door chimed and a woman hurried in. She was about Antonio's age, with silver hair pulled back in a bun and warm brown eyes. She wore a thick cardigan and house slippers like she'd left home in a rush. The moment she saw Antonio, her face filled with concern. "What's wrong? Are you okay? Is someone hurt?" She rushed over to their table. I'm fine," Antonio assured her, standing to kiss her cheek. "Sit, please. I want you to meet someone very special." He gestured to Rosa, who suddenly felt very small and very dirty in her worn-out clothes, even with the nice scarf wrapped around her shoulders. Francesca looked at Rosa, her expression confused but curious. She sat down next to her husband. "This is Rosa," Antonio said. "Tonight she came into our restaurant. She was hungry, living on the streets, and she asked if she could play our piano for food. He reached across the table and gently touched Rosa's hand. And what she played, Francesca. I have never heard anything like it. She made the whole restaurant cry. Everyone, even me. Francesca's eyes widened. She looked at Rosa with new interest, seeing past the dirty clothes and messy hair. You played our piano? Rosa nodded shyly. Yes, ma'am. My grandmother taught me before she died. Tell her, Antonio urged. Tell her your story. So Rosa told it again. About her grandmother. About being alone. About the streets. About being so hungry and desperate that she walked into a fancy restaurant and begged to play piano. Her voice shook through parts of it, and by the end, Francesca had tears running down her face. Oh, you poor child, Francesca breathed. She reached out and took both of Rosa's hands in hers. Her hands were warm and soft, with wrinkles that came from years of hard work and laughter. 12 years old, alone, that's not right. That should never happen to a child. Antonio cleared his throat. I was thinking, he said, looking at his wife carefully. We have that apartment above the restaurant, the one we've been using for storage. Francesca's eyes snapped to her husband's face. She stared at him for a long moment. We could clean it out, Antonio continued. Make it livable again. It's small, but it has a bedroom, a bathroom, a little kitchen. It's warm and safe, and he paused. Rosa could live there. We could help her get back into school and... He glanced at the piano. She could play here. Friday and Saturday nights, maybe. People would come just to hear her. I know they would. Rosa's heart was beating so fast she thought it might fly right out of her chest. Was he saying what she thought he was saying? A place to live? A real place? Francesca was quiet for a moment, still holding Rosa's hands. Then she looked at the girl with eyes full of something Rosa hadn't seen in a long time. Motherly love, care, the look her grandmother used to give her. We never had children, Francesca said softly. It just wasn't meant to be for us. We have this restaurant, we have each other, and that's been enough. But maybe... She looked at Antonio, then back at Rosa. Maybe this is why. Maybe we were waiting for you. Rosa couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. This couldn't be real. People didn't just offer you a home, a life, a future. Not when you were a nobody street kid with nothing to give back. I don't understand, Rosa whispered. Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me. Antonio smiled, and it was the kindest smile Rosa had ever seen. I was you once, he said quietly. Not exactly the same, but close enough. When I was 8 years old in Sicily, my mother died. My father was already gone. My brothers and I had nothing. We begged on the streets. We stole food to survive. His eyes got distant, remembering. Then a man who owned a bakery caught me stealing bread. I thought he would call the police. Instead, he gave me a job. Let me sleep in his back room. Taught me to bake. He saved my life. He focused back on Rosa. I never forgot that kindness. I swore that if I ever had the chance, I would do the same for someone else. And tonight, you walked through that door. You played that piano. And I knew. This is my chance. This is how I pay forward what was given to me. Francesca squeezed Rosa's hands. We can't replace your grandmother. No one could. But we can offer you a home, a family of sorts, a place where you belong. She smiled. And honestly, this old restaurant could use some beautiful music. That piano has been silent for too long. Rosa tried to speak, but no words came out. Just tears. They poured down her face, but these were different from all the tears she'd cried in the past 3 weeks. These weren't tears of fear or grief or hunger. These were tears of relief, of joy, of hope finally blooming after being crushed down for so long. Yes, she finally managed to whisper. Yes, please. Thank you. Thank you so much. Francesca pulled Rosa into a hug, and Rosa let herself be held. She buried her face in this stranger's shoulder and cried like she hadn't been able to since her grandmother died. She cried for everything she'd lost and everything she was being given. She cried because someone cared, because she wasn't alone anymore. Antonio stood up and pulled out his phone. I have a friend, he said, wiping his own eyes. She works with youth services. She can help us make this official. Make sure everything is done properly. We'll call her first thing in the morning. Lisa, who had been sitting at a nearby table giving them privacy but unwilling to leave, came over. And tonight she'll stay with us, she said firmly. We'll get her cleaned up, give her some of my daughter's clothes, let her sleep in a real bed. Tomorrow we'll figure out the rest. Antonio nodded gratefully. Thank you. Thank you for caring. How could we not? Lisa said, looking at Rosa with tender eyes. After what she gave us tonight? After that music? She's special. Anyone can see that. The restaurant was starting to close down around them. Waiters were clearing tables, sweeping floors. But they all kept glancing over at Rosa, smiling when they caught her eye. They'd all been there for the performance. They'd all felt the magic. Rosa sat there, wrapped in a warm scarf she didn't own that morning, her stomach full of the best food she'd ever eaten, surrounded by people who cared about her. In her pocket was more money than she'd ever had, and now impossibly she had a future. A real future with a home and school and music. She thought about her grandmother and what she would say if she could see this moment. Rosa could almost hear her voice, soft and loving. "See, Bambina? I told you music was magic. It opens doors. It touches hearts. It changes everything." Rosa smiled through her tears. Her grandmother had been right all along. 3 months passed like a dream Rosa was afraid she might wake up from. But every morning she opened her eyes in the small apartment above Antonio's restaurant, in a real bed with clean sheets and a warm blanket, and realized it was all real. This was her life now. The apartment was tiny, just one room really, with a bathroom and a corner that served as a kitchen. But to Rosa it was a palace. Francesca had helped her paint the walls a soft yellow color that made the whole place feel sunny even on gray days. They'd found furniture at thrift stores and garage sales, a small bed, a dresser, a table and 2 chairs. Nothing fancy, but everything was hers. The best part was that she could hear the piano from upstairs. Sometimes, late at night when the restaurant was closed, Antonio would let her come down and practice. She'd play for hours and he'd sit at the bar doing paperwork, listening. He never complained. He said it was the best background music he could ask for. Lisa had been true to her word. She'd helped Rosa get enrolled in school, bought her clothes and supplies, and checked on her every few days. Rosa was catching up fast, even though she'd missed almost a month. The teachers were patient with her, especially once they heard her story. Kids at school were curious at first, some even mean, but most of them came around once they realized Rosa wasn't looking for pity. She just wanted to be normal. But Friday and Saturday nights were when Rosa's new life really came alive. Those were the nights she played at the restaurant. Antonio had been right. Word spread fast about the little girl who played piano at his restaurant. The first Friday after everything happened, 40 extra people showed up, having heard from friends and family about the girl who made everyone cry. The restaurant was so packed they had to turn people away. Rosa had been terrified that first night. What if she couldn't do it again? What if the magic was gone? What if people were disappointed? But the moment her fingers touched the keys, everything else fell away. She played the same piece she'd played that first desperate night, and once again the restaurant fell silent. Once again grown adults found themselves crying into their napkins. Once again Rosa proved that her gift was real. It became a thing. A weekly event. People made reservations weeks in advance just to hear Rosa play. The businessman who'd given her that first $100 came back every Saturday, always sitting at the same table, always leaving a generous tip for Rosa in a white envelope. The elderly man from the bar brought his son one night, wanting him to hear what real music sounded like. A reporter from the local newspaper heard about Rosa and came to do a story. She sat through an entire performance with tears streaming down her face, then interviewed Rosa afterward. The article ran on the front page of the Sunday paper with a photo of Rosa at the piano, her eyes closed, completely lost in the music. The headline read, "From the streets to standing ovations, one girl's journey through music." After that, everything exploded. A local news station wanted to do a segment, then a regional television show called. Suddenly, Rosa wasn't just the girl who played at Antonio's restaurant. She was becoming something bigger, though she didn't quite understand what. Through it all, Antonio and Francesca kept her grounded. They made sure she did her homework before practice. They insisted she eat vegetables even when she complained. They tucked her in at night sometimes, when she had nightmares about being back on the streets. They weren't her grandmother and they didn't try to be, but they loved her in their own way. And Rosa loved them back. The money Rosa earned from tips and the small salary Antonio paid her went into a savings account that Francesca helped her open. For college, Francesca would say, or music school, whatever you want for your future. The idea that Rosa had a future, that she could plan for years ahead instead of just tomorrow, Still felt unreal sometimes. One Saturday night in January, exactly 4 months after that first desperate evening, something unexpected happened. Rosa was playing during dinner service like always. The restaurant was packed as usual. She'd just finished one song and was about to start another when the door opened. A woman walked in and Rosa felt her breath catch. She was elegant, wearing an expensive coat and carrying herself like someone important. But what made Rosa stare was that the woman went straight to Antonio, whispered something to him, and then both of them looked at Rosa. Antonio came over to the piano with the woman following behind him. He was smiling so big his whole face crinkled. "Rosa," he said, and his voice was shaking with excitement. "This is Mrs. Chen. She's from the Riverside Music Conservatory. She's here to listen to you play." Rosa's hands froze on the keys. The Riverside Conservatory was famous. Real musicians went there, people who went on to play in orchestras and concert halls. It wasn't for street kids like her. Mrs. Chen smiled warmly. "I saw the news story about you," she said, "and I had to hear for myself. Would you play something for me?" Rosa looked at Antonio, who nodded encouragingly. She looked at Francesca, who was standing by the kitchen door with her hands clasped together hopefully. She looked around at all the familiar faces in the restaurant, people who came every week now just to hear her play. Then she looked at the piano, this instrument that had saved her life, this gift her grandmother had given her. Rosa took a deep breath and began to play. But this time she didn't play the piece from that first night. She played something new, something she'd been working on for weeks. It was her own arrangement, a combination of pieces her grandmother had taught her, woven together with her own additions. It told a story, her story. It started sad and lost, the notes wandering like a child with nowhere to go. Then gradually it found hope. The melody strengthened, grew braver. Light crept into the music like sunrise after a long night. And finally it soared into something beautiful and joyful. It was the sound of finding home, of being saved, of love and second chances. Rosa played with everything she had. She played for her grandmother, who had taught her that music was magic. She played for Antonio and Francesca, who had given her a home when she had nothing. She played for Lisa and all the kind strangers who had helped her that first night. She played for every person who had ever felt lost and alone, and she played for herself, for the scared little girl she'd been and the stronger person she was becoming. When the last note faded, Rosa opened her eyes. Mrs. Chen was crying. Antonio was crying. Half the restaurant was crying as usual. But they were also smiling. Mrs. Chen stood up and walked to the piano. She knelt down beside Rosa, not caring that her expensive coat touched the dusty floor. "That was extraordinary," she said quietly. "I've taught music for 30 years and I've rarely heard anything so pure and honest." She paused. "Rosa, how would you feel about attending the conservatory? We have a special program for gifted young musicians, full scholarship. You'd come on Saturdays for lessons and classes." Rosa couldn't speak. She just nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. The restaurant erupted in applause. People were standing, cheering, whistling. The businessman at his usual table was clapping so hard it looked painful. Random people were hugging each other like this was their own victory, because in a way it was. Everyone in that restaurant had been part of Rosa's journey. They'd seen her at her lowest and watched her rise. They'd supported her week after week, coming back not just for the music but because they believed in her. They'd invested their hearts in this little girl's story, and now they were seeing her succeed. That night, after the restaurant closed and everyone went home, Rosa sat at the piano alone. Well, not completely alone. Antonio was counting the register at the bar and Francesca was wiping down tables. But quiet enough that Rosa could think. She thought about that October night 4 months ago when she'd been so hungry and desperate that she'd walked into a fancy restaurant and begged to play piano for food. She thought about how close she'd come to giving up on everything. She thought about her grandmother and wished so badly she could tell her about everything that had happened. Then Rosa smiled, because she realized her grandmother already knew. Every time Rosa played, she felt her grandmother's presence. In every note, every melody, every moment her fingers danced across the keys, her grandmother was there. Rosa had come to this restaurant with nothing but grief and hunger and a desperate hope. She'd left with everything. A home, a family, a future. and the knowledge that sometimes the darkest moments in our lives are just before everything changes. She placed her hands on the piano keys one more time, playing softly, just for herself. The music floated through the empty restaurant, gentle and grateful. It was a thank you to the universe, to kindness, to second chances, and to the magic of never giving up. Outside, snow began to fall on the city streets, covering everything in clean white. And inside Antonio's restaurant, a 12-year-old girl who used to beg for food played piano and knew finally that she was home.